My name is Daniel Johnston. This is the name of my tape. And it's Hi, How Are You? And I was having a nervous breakdown when I recorded it.
Try to remember, but my feelings can't know.
And he was a skinny little kid, fairly demented. And he said, I just want to give you my tape. And I put it on the tape player, and it just blew my mind.
There's really nothing to even compare it to. It goes way beyond Dylan's basement recordings, or any other body of work that I can think of.
Okay, welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about music documentaries. I'm Dave Lizzerbram, here with
Andrew Keats. David, the typical cadence is here with my co-host, Andrew Keats. So, you really threw a curveball.
Okay.
Brought me off cue.
I'm leaving this in. This is great.
Right,
this is good content here. But I'm not only here with Andrew Keats. That was such a funny cue. If that was my cue to you, Noah, that would have been really good. We're joined by Noah Bond, who is a drummer of note. And Andy and I kind of came across Noah because a month or so ago, I don't know, as we're recording this, we went to see the band Bonnie Doon at the Casbah here in San Diego. And that is like, I mean, Andy and I are way into Bonnie. We're Doon heads. I don't know if that's even a term.
I think they call them Dooners.
Oh, yeah. Andy and I are hardcore Dooners now. And no, we felt it was a great band, great show, fell in love with it. We were talking to the singers of the band afterwards, and I mentioned the podcast, or Andy did, one of us, and they were like, "Oh, you got to talk to Noah. He's the guy. He's way into that stuff." And then come to find out that you also play drums on one of our favorite albums of the year by Cutworms.
Mm-hmm.
We go see Bonnie Doon live, listen to Cutworms, go see them, etc.
Yeah.
Anyway, Andy, give us your take on this.
The guys were basically like jumping over themselves to be like, Noah is the one who you need to talk to. He has seen every music documentary that there is. So.
Well, it's because we it wasn't the tour that you saw us on, but there was a previous tour where we had a kind of a bunch of days to kill in Detroit, where the band is from. And we had a Airbnb that was me and Cole, the guy who plays keys in the band, and Bonnie Doon's manager, Peyton. And, we just really had nothing to do but watch TV. But all I want to watch is rock docs. So we watched pretty much the entire Grateful Dead Long Strange Trip. We watched the newer Credence doc on Netflix. Okay. And I kept going. I was going to keep going, and then eventually they were like, stop. This is like too much. Can we watch anything else? But I've just always been obsessed with rock docs and rock movies. I mean, it's I don't care if it's a band that I know nothing about or frankly don't even like. I'm up for it.
Often I'd prefer it.
Yeah.
Often there's like an inverse correlation to how much I like the band or their music and how much I like the movie. Not
always interesting to me. There's always something interesting to take away from it.
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily like if I hate a band. I mean, sometimes, or an artist, and sometimes that's interesting as well. But like if it's somebody I don't really know about or maybe like I've heard some of the stuff but never really connected with it.
Right.
Like the documentary often is a way in.
Right.
So that's definitely an appeal.
Mm-hmm. No, you'll have a unique perspective here on something that has come up from time to time on the show. So two of the noted Rock Docs people within the Rock Docs universe, frequent appearances in the Rock Docs world are Dave Grohl and Questlove.
Yeah.
And we have drawn a corollary that perhaps, much as catchers make great play-by-play announcers, or color commentators in baseball, as people who have the whole game before in front of them, and they're used to seeing the whole thing rather than just their sliver of it, that perhaps drummers have that same perspective, and that explains their outsized influence in the rock docs genre. And so here you are,
Yeah.
a drummer on two of the best albums of the year, and apparently a rock doc's head. Is there anything to this theory?
I never thought of it that way, but I do think something about being a drummer and especially when you're a drummer like me, that's kind of bit of a hired gun sort of guy. Um, you see a lot of stuff. I mean, I play right now in 4 or 5 bands that I tour with somewhat regularly, and each one kind of operates a little differently and does things differently and plays different size shows, or I don't know. And I think as a drummer, you are kind of like othered in a way from the rest of the group. It's like, it's funny that it's funny that you guys are interviewing me, because it's like I've only done a few podcasts before, but I'm always like, you want to talk to me? Don't you want to talk to the guy singing or the guitar player or something like that? So maybe we're kind of like a silent observer in this stuff. Though there's a whole nother thing with Dave Grohl that it's like a theory I can't really take credit for, which is that he's really actively trying to solidify his place in kind of the new classic rock world, where he's kind of like overexerting himself and influence into these rock docs and playing with Paul McCartney and doing this. I have no issue with Dave Grohl. It's just a funny thing that I've observed, that he's like, yeah, he's just like always popping up, and he always seems to be kind of, I'm always kind of just like, Dave, you were in one of the greatest bands of all time, 2 great bands, we kind of get it, like, you're great. You don't need to be constantly, you're gonna be a classic rock star,
Yeah,
you don't need to be constantly in these docs and stuff.
He has reached the point that you almost can't put him in your rock doc at this point.
Yeah.
You've got to find somebody else to voice that perspective.
Well, I'll be honest, he did that Sound City doc, which I love, but I kind of stopped watching it once he buys the Neve board and starts doing stuff. I like the other stuff more.
Yeah, the historical part of that, we haven't done an episode about that, although we may, spoiler alert, have one coming up soon.
It's a good one.
If our frequent guest Nick McCann, if we can schedule him. Yeah, another drummer question for you. Yeah. Rock docs related. We not too long ago we did an episode about the Iggy and the Stooges documentary, Gimme Danger. And Iggy famously started out as a drummer.
Right.
But he said more or less his motivation to stop being a drummer is he got tired of, just looking at a guy shaking his ass in front of him. So I guess that's not so much a question as just kind of like a comment on that kind of perspective. Like, if you want to have that kind of outside perspective and hang back, or if you've really got that burning desire to, certainly nobody is more of a front person than Iggy Pop. I guess he couldn't be, it just wasn't the right spot for him. You got to find your right natural position.
Yeah, I think I'm in my natural position. I'd rather be looking at their butts than looking right into the faces of people in the crowd.
Okay, that's our
maybe another maybe a better way to phrase it is God, I wish I could remember who said it. I'm gonna say Levon Helm, but it probably isn't. But he said he had the best seat in the house.
Yeah.
Best.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, all of the bands that I currently tour with, like Bonnie Doon and Cutworms and John Andrews and the Ons and a few other bands, but they're all bands that I was a fan of before I even started playing drums in their band. So in a lot of ways, it is truly like that. Like, I'm getting to kind of watch the show, even though I'm part of the show. That makes sense.
It does. Actually, I do have another question. So you mentioned the Grateful Dead documentary Long Strange Trip. When Andy and I are both Grateful Dead fans, when we saw Bonnie Doon, that was like one of the kind of things we referenced when we were talking about it. Like, it's kind of like, if you like that sort of Americana, somewhat jammy kind of thing, there's an element of that there.
Mhm.
I guess are those guys like into the Dead? I guess I would ask, but also like we're always kind of worried about, we're always kind of curious about like the music industry, meaning like is there is there an interest to like link into the jam band world in any way? Because that seems like, I mean, just blatantly economically a pretty good move.
Just in terms
Yeah,
of
And
sales.
you see a lot of bands that don't really jam exactly, but like kind of get into that world, and then it's just like they can play forever. You know, there's festivals.
Yeah.
There's, there's a whole infrastructure there.
I have to be I have to be careful what I say.
Okay, we won't put you on the spot.
But in regard to Bonnie Doon, you know, they are 100% Dead fans, and Jake, their drummer, who I sub for the tours, occasionally, he's probably the biggest Deadhead in the band, and I think for them it's kind of like Grateful Dead, Neil Young. You know, I don't want to put speak for them too much, but you know, they're kind of they're taking a lot of spiritually, they're taking a lot from that, and they're in that aesthetic, and certainly a way of kind of viewing music and the way it should exist in the world and the way that they want to make it. But yeah, I mean, the phenomena of bands kind of dipping into the jam market, you know, because you know, when I was growing up, you know, where I live in Massachusetts, without going too much into it, you know, sort of the most countercultural thing you could be into is probably Grateful Dead and, you know, Fish or something like that. Like for some reason, punk rock like didn't really exist where I am growing up, and if it did, it was kind of in a Dinosaur Jr. or like a rec hall ska punk band kind of vibe. But it was, you know, at some point it became really not cool in a hip kind of hipster way, pre-hipster way, to like jam bands. And then all of a sudden, when I started getting older, all these bands that I thought would want nothing to do with the Grateful Dead or jamming are suddenly totally into it, and I seem to be drawing all these influence from it. So I think there is some genuine idea of people like the idea of kind of freeform improvisational music, but I think cynically, yeah, you're probably right. There are some people thinking that, well, if we can be thrown on a jam band bill, then maybe we can, you know, get a little busier, maybe get access to a little more, some different opportunities, something like that. I can say that nobody I play with has that in mind, but I've, you know, in private conversations. Oh yeah, it's not. I don't think it's a bad way.
You're a musician. You got to make a buck. You want people to hear your music. I don't know.
I think anytime you talk about people kind of making those kinds of conscious moves, though, it may be I didn't mean to phrase it as a bad way, but it's certainly something that people talk about and think about. I'll just leave it at that.
It seems like that that Day of the Dead compilation album with the covers from all those different sort of Brooklyn bands in like 2013 or 2014 was like the sea change there, where suddenly it was like okay for the hipster set to say that they liked the Grateful Dead.
I don't know that one. That's like a cover record of Dead.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. It's the National guys were like the main kind of drivers behind it. And but
War
like
on
I mean,
and
Courtney Barnett, and I mean, War on Drugs. That was kind of when I first maybe heard about them.
Wow.
And I mean, there's a ton of artists that that now are you know, or some of them are even bigger now, and they had like some of the folks from Sonic Youth and a bunch of other interesting folks on there.
That's
Wilco,
awesome.
etc. So yeah, check it out. It's like you know, 50 tracks or something. It's a deep dive. If you're got a long drive on the in the tour van or something like that.
Oh, it's coming. Yeah.
All right, so we should eventually. I haven't even mentioned what we're going to talk about.
The ostensible topic of this episode.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you know, typically we invite our guests to select a film they would like to discuss. Your choice was, I would, you know, definitely call this a classic in the rock doc genre that we just haven't had a chance to get to. The Devil and Daniel Johnston. It's about the sort of outsider artist, folk artist, whatever you want to call it, Daniel Johnston. Came out in 2005, directed by Now, this is a friend of the podcast, and I'm going to insult him by not being able to pronounce his name. As a person with a hard to pronounce a name myself, I sympathize, Jeff. But Jeff Feuerzeig is what I'm going to go with. Hopefully, that's relatively close. Jeff,
Sounds right.
We've been in touch. You can come on the podcast and yell at me for getting your name wrong. But anyway, let's just do the old round table here. Andy, when did you see this film the first time, and what was your relationship with Daniel Johnston and his music prior to the film, if any?
So the first time I ever heard of Daniel Johnston was after Kids came out when I was in middle school, and they play Casper in that movie, and I remember we were all like, "What the hell is that song? What is that creepy like childlike like haunted song that they play?" So somebody looked it up, and I think somebody either had a hip brother or something like that came back with a story that was fairly close to the accurate story of who Daniel Johnston was. Close enough for the pre-internet era. And then I did not really spend much time with his music between then and when this movie came out. And it was like, this was a pretty big movie, I recall, when it came out. It was sort of in art house theaters and that sort of thing. And I saw it then, I believe in Baltimore. And haven't seen it since then until just now.
But I mean, did you at any point dig into the catalog other than watching the movie?
No, not really. I think I probably picked up and like listened to some stuff when I saw the movie, but I cannot ever have claimed to have been a Johnston head.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, he's kind of a guy. I'm sure I heard about him through Kurt Cobain's T-shirt. Because that was like when I was in high school, that was just everywhere. Was him wearing that, nice to meet you, Daniel Johnston T-shirt.
The two pieces of Kurt Cobain taste that I really recall that really stand out are his love of Daniel Johnston and his love of the movie Over the Edge with Matt Dillon. You guys seen that movie?
Yeah. I didn't know he was a fan of that. Okay.
Yeah, he says at one point that was like one of his favorite movies, and that there was like a sort of an inspiration to like some of his songwriting with that.
Wow,
interesting. Well, unfortunately, he's not available to come on Rock Docs to discuss that, but otherwise you'd be invited. I'm so that's kind of where I heard about Daniel Johnston, and he's kind of a guy. I have to say, like, this was a big gap in my Rock Docs viewing knowledge, meaning I watched this movie the first time like 2 days ago. It was just one of those things where like I missed it for whatever reason when it was in theaters, and back in those days, this was like before streaming, and like it was sort of in that like nether zone between like when like DVDs were kind of going out, sort of there, kind of Blockbuster and whatever was kind of dying, and the local the local rental place was struggling. But before there really was like Netflix DVD rental market too much. There was this kind of like gap year in the 2000s or this weird nether region. So I kind of missed it. And his music I'd heard from time to time. It was the kind of thing where like it was always like supposed to be cool, and I would hear it on a mixtape or a here or there whatever, and I always kind of enjoyed it when I heard it. But it was always like one of these things where it was like, oh, you should listen to Daniel Johnston. It's cool. He's like an outsider, like a troubled person, and this music is kind of weird. And like a lot of that type of stuff I like, but it's also can seem like an assignment. You know what I mean? It could seem like one of these things like where you're supposed to like this, and it might be weird or uncomfortable, and so you should do your homework. And I just never found
sort of an
the
IQ test. It's like, and if you don't like it, then I will be judging you harshly.
A little bit like that. So I never like had that day where I like just dove in. And watching the movie now, I'm like, wow, this is cool. Like I want to spend more time with the music, and I get, I have a much different appreciation of the guy, and where he was coming from. But so this really filled in a lot of gaps for me. Noah, how did you come across Daniel Johnston and the movie or the movie?
Yeah, well, it's very funny how you were talking about that gap year of video stores and stuff like that, because I first found this documentary when I was working at a video store. There was like an independent video store, like where I went to college, and right after I graduated, the summer after I graduated, I started working there. And So I gotta think I must have seen it, yeah, like right when it came out on DVD, maybe 2006 or something like that. And a coworker was just like, "You got to watch this," and I knew nothing about Daniel Johnston. Um, and in fact, like I feel a little awkward even choosing this movie to talk about because I'm also not really an authority on his music. I mean, I enjoy his music and I've listened to it a bunch. But you know, some of my bandmates, like this guy John Andrews, who I play with in John Andrews and the Ons, he's a much more hard, like he'd probably be seeing me choose this movie for this podcast and be rolling his eyes because he's like a real actual authority on Daniel Johnston and his work, and I think he owns some of his artwork and certainly has tapes and stuff like that. But I just rented this movie and I brought it home and watched it with my housemates, and I was honestly like floored because it felt like no other documentary or rock documentary I'd ever seen before, for like a bunch of reasons. But the one that really comes to mind is just the like source material in this documentary is like no other documentary I've seen, really, in the sense that Daniel Johnston he has audio diaries we hear, he has video diaries that we hear, you know, he records arguments with his mother, you know, he's like, it's like, and there's so much artwork and there's so much home video, and I just had never, you know, it's like I'd been kind of used to this one format of rock doc, and then and then the time when I saw this movie, it just kind of like, it really just kind of blew my mind. And I bought the DVD, and it's always kind of been one of my favorite, if not my favorite, rock docs, and you know, of all the ones I've seen, really just because I think it does such a good job at kind of like, you know, the guy who made this movie really did his homework. I can't believe the the amount of material that is in the movie, you know.
Yeah, it really stands apart, especially from sort of the streamer era docs, which so often seem to be like the sort of like flowchart of whether a streamer era doc gets made is like, do they have a large audience that will watch this? If yes, then is the estate willing to provide like full musical, you know, for full access to the content? And then if so, like, all right, we're good to go. You know, we don't really even need a story. You know, that we'll find one. Like we can figure that out later.
Right.
Whereas this has so much of that source material you talk about, and just the story is so wild. It's like from a time when, to make a music documentary, it had to stand on its own for like the art film set, you know, for
Right.
people who weren't going to care about music documentaries as a product unto themselves, that it, you know, it needed to be able to stand on its own. And I mean, you know, which, not to say that, you know, that he's not a worthy artist in his own right, but the story is just so surreal and just keeps
Right.
delivering all the way through. It's quite a gripping watch.
Mhm.
Yeah, kind of no on what you were saying, just about not like necessarily being the biggest fan. I mean, one of the premises of this podcast that we sometimes drift away from is like, you know, kind of taking these documentaries as a film, like meaning just the documentary itself is enough of a subject, you know, and a text, so to speak, to discuss. And like, you don't have to come into it with a lot of prior knowledge, you know,
Yeah.
and if you do, that informs your take on it. But you know, I mean, it sort of should be enough. But yeah, it kind of falls into that genre. I mean, it definitely is of a piece, I guess, with documentaries that were relatively contemporary, like Dig, which is also kind of like in the genre of like how is this all on film? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, how did they have this? And it's kind of incredible. Plus, just the amount of work to go through it all.
Right.
I mean, I guess the Kanye one, Genius from last year, although obviously a complicated figure in a different way. You know, that there was a guy who was just filming him. You know what I mean? Who was just on,
Right.
you know, like a scout that was just on a guy, you know, way before anybody else was.
And
but It's
And
not
that's
quite the
wild,
same
but
thing.
that was wild for like 9 months of that filming.
Right.
But pretty early on, it was like, oh, this is going to be a commercially viable project.
Right.
Where like
Yeah. Even though it took 20 years to come out.
it
But
took
yeah.
20 years.
Right.
To come, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, being 25 minutes of this, we should sort of introduce people who haven't seen this or don't know who he is, like who Daniel Johnston is and what this is about. Because most people outside of this film, or like being, a specific genre of music nerd, probably never heard of this guy. He's no longer with us. But I mean, I guess the brief biography of this complicated person is that, like, he's a guy from a religious Church of Christ family in West Virginia, is where he kind of started out. Lived in Texas for a while. Seems like he came from a fairly conventional family. His parents are very featured heavily in the movie, brothers and sisters, and Daniel, was had various mental health issues, manic depression, bipolar. I'm not exactly sure what all the diagnoses he had are. I mean, he spent many years in uh, mental facilities, and had a lot of trouble, living an independent life, as a quote unquote productive member of society. His family seems to have just been a very loving and tolerant as much as possible of his quirks and so forth. He was always obsessed with art. He was kind of a comic type illustrator, and produced huge volume of art. And I mean, just kind of a multimedia artist, I would say, where he filmed himself a lot. He filmed other people. He was just, making movies with whatever he had at hand, animated, kind of everything. And then also a musician, where he played piano and later guitar and made up his own songs. And they're very, musically very simple, in terms of the chord, structure, but very often very affecting. And because of his, um, you know, different, you know, perspective on things, because of what he was struggling with, he just was very emotionally honest and raw. He wasn't guarded in any way, and so you get this sort of purity. And I mean, there's a lot more to the story than that, of course. I mean, there's a whole film and more to say about him, but the guy had a lot of problems, but he certainly created a lot of fantastic art. And there were people that identified him for his artistic talent and really championed him. And some of those people are in this film. And it really, some people tried to help him, and it didn't always work out. But so it's just kind of this guy's life story, really, of this interesting person. It definitely doesn't take the perspective of making fun of the guy, or look at this weirdo. It's very empathetic.
Mhm.
And he's just a really interesting character in the film. But I don't know, does that seem like a reasonable description of the guy and his arc, his life story?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's one part where his mom, after one of his breakdowns, um, is telling him, I worry your behavior is compulsive, that like you can't stop yourself from doing this. And it was interesting she used that word, because from the beginning of the movie, his artistic endeavors seem so compulsive.
Mhm.
Like it seems to just come out of him and have no choice but to come out of him, whether he's making little home films reenacting like the images of his mom yelling at him,
Mhm.
which he recorded and then reenacted them and made them into movies, or whether he's doing cartoons or writing music about sort of what's going on in his head. It's like it's just burst, like all of these different creative expressions are bursting out of him. And then for her to sort of describe his sort of most aggressive reactions to his mental health problems in the same way, seems to me that those two things, that's probably not a coincidental relationship.
Right.
Yeah, he had a, I guess the kind of central story here, and something they hook on as like a big part of his narrative in terms of the music. I don't know if this is, I'm not really sure even how to take this. Is his the kind of love story. He met this woman, Kathy. No, I'm not. I'm trying to remember. Is it Kathy?
No, I think
Laura. Right,
Laura. Yeah,
Laura. Yeah, and he met this woman, and had this very strong crush attraction with her. They
Infatuation.
were infatuation. And he was at the time kind of filming everything that he was doing and recording. So there's contemporary film and recordings of this woman who he met in art class. And that so he has this infatuation with her. He wants her to love him. He's filming her and recording her.
gets her
And
to record. He gets her to say "I love you" and
right,
records
he
it.
gets her to say "I love you, Dan," which he then, it seems like this is a treasure object for him. He comes to find out that she has a boyfriend, and eventually the like kind of funny twist on is that she, like, her boyfriend became a mortician, and they that just kind of adds a little flavor to it. And later Daniel ran into the guy at the funeral home of like some family member for service for some family members. So that's a cute little interesting moment. But he falls in love with this woman, and then the movie posits that he more or less used her as his muse, his artistic muse, for the remainder of basically his life,
Right.
and wrote hundreds of songs about her, and she appears frequently in his art. And even, and that basically, like, he she's like the Beatrice in Dante, like he created
Right.
this whole universe of art based on just love of this unrequited romance. And
And you gotta wonder why she's not in the documentary.
Yeah.
well,
Yeah, it sort
okay,
of stands. It sort of stands there as a ghost in the film, right? That because I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that the movie should have been more critical of it, but the movie is not at all critical of this sort of
They
relationship.
view it very innocently.
Yes, they view it
Whereas,
very
maybe from today we can look at it and feel a little creeped out about it.
Yeah, exactly. And she isn't in it. You're right.
Right.
And yeah, so I don't know. It sort of just hangs out there as like, is this as simple as this very artistic but troubled person who had a sort of artistic inspiration around this unrequited
Right.
love, or is there something potentially scarier about it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would I for some reason and maybe it's just because of my experience with with the documentary, but I'm tempted to sort of give him some benefit of the doubt, just in the sense of just his upbringing and his religious upbringing, and just sort of the innocence he brings to other things in his life. I don't know, but it is upon rewatching it, because I rewatched it before we started recording. It did definitely stand out to me. I thought, I wonder why this woman's not in this documentary
Yeah.
at all, and if that meant something, or how she felt about it. But in general, what it kind of brings, it's like one example in what I think is like kind of like one way you could look at the whole documentary, which is this sense of or just the idea of myth building.
Yeah.
And people, because if you're somebody that's going to be attracted to a rock and roll documentary, you you probably are attracted to the notion of these kind of mythical figures. We bring so much of ourselves and what we imagine these people to be. And for most people before this documentary, Daniel Johnston was probably a pretty mysterious figure that produced this art. And maybe you knew some of the big stories from his life, but you kind of didn't really you kind of didn't really see what he was like. But it's and I experience that all the time with documentaries or just music in general, where I kind of create this mythical idea of who this person is in my head, and what they're all about. But upon rewatching this movie, I was thinking to myself, man, this guy's story is it plays out like you were saying, like it's like it just keeps delivering on itself in sort of the mythical structure of this guy and his career and his life.
Yeah.
And for some reason, it never dawned on me when I was really watching it before, and they even reference it in the movie, but like how much of this is the myth that the people in his life and his family and the documentarian are bringing to it, and how much of this myth is something that he created and was maybe somewhat conscious of. I mean, there's one point in the documentary where I think his friend from high school says that, these things that he would record and things that would happen in his house, they happened, but not necessarily without provocation. I mean, he was upsetting his mother so he could record her yelling at him. And so he had some awareness of his fame and wanting to be famous and following these ideas of what that means in this world or whatever. But I know, I just find that really interesting, especially watching it today where you're like looking at social media. People are constantly recording and videotaping themselves. And the context is totally different, right? Because the world we live in now, it's kind of it's a grosser, it's like a more demented thing in a way.
Yeah, you fully expect it to be seen by people if you do it.
Exactly.
Now.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we're doing these things to be seen, where I don't know if Dan, I can't really tell if he had some vision that all of this material he was creating, and I mean, I think he wanted to be famous, but I don't know if he really had the sense that like a documentary like this would be made about his life or something. Yet the plot points of this documentary play so well in this sort of mythic structure of his life and career. I mean, that's sort of what gets me hung up when I'm watching it. It's just like, is that sort of idea,
Yeah. I mean, and it so there's this part where he's in Austin and he's experiencing like real like musical success. He's appeared on MTV. He's winning awards in the Austin Music Awards. He's really an up and coming musician by any sort of popular definition. And he has, I guess, is it his first true breakdown? I mean, he's had different trips to institutions, some of which they describe as being for depression. This seems like the first one that was sort of maybe like a delusional break.
Yeah.
This is the Butthole Surfers show, LSD dose thing,
and that whole period from
Okay, can we time out? Can we talk about the interview with Gibby Haynes from Butthole Surfers?
Yeah, I mean that's just another brilliant moment. Like, yeah, I mean you should explain it.
This is a first. This is a first in the rock doc canon, where they're interviewing Gibby Haynes, the lead singer provocateur of the Texas band the Butthole Surfers, about this event with Daniel Johnston at a Butthole Surfer show in the 80s. And now typically you think of somebody being interviewed in a music documentary, they're sitting in a room, maybe they're next to a big mixing board. That's a popular one. Or sometimes like on stage, like before the show or after the show or backstage. Nope. He's in the dentist chair having some work done on his real jacked up teeth. You get right up in there. If you are into dental stuff, this is the scene for you. Yeah. So, okay. All right.
And well, they ask him, did you give him acid? That sends him off on his break. And I got to tell you, I didn't find his denial of that question entirely convincing.
He gives a very unconvincing no.
It's like, I don't think I would give a guy like that acid. He seems like he's unstable.
Yeah.
But,
I also, it must have been that the director came to him. Yeah. He must have had that idea, like, all right, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it at the dentist's office.
I thought you were going to say it. For the director to ask him that, I got a sneaking suspicion somebody else told him.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
He's the one who gave it to him. And he was just like, well, I don't know any way to get this out here except to just ask him on camera.
Right.
Yeah.
So so then all of his friends who are around his life, and during his rise, there was sort of this. He was working at McDonald's. It was part of the story. Presumably when local writers would write about him, they would say, "Oh, this sort of peculiar genius who works at McDonald's and writes these folk songs." Um, and there was like this innocence about him, and multiple different friends say that it was like during this break that they realized, oh, like the childlike purity that was so attractive about his music, we are realizing is not the only thing that's happening here, and that there is
Right.
something much scarier happening beneath. And one, I mean, I think it's possible that was the case with his infatuation with Laura. For another, it's just like that becomes this recurring thing where like you can't shake that eerie childlike quality of some of his music, and yet that like the actual dramatic points of his life are anything but childlike. They're as they're as extreme as events can be in a person's life. It's wild how many of them there are that
Right.
we have to go through.
I mean, I think that's sort of, but in a way that is also kind of a classic thing of these people are, some of the people that are capable of making art like this are incredibly complex people. And that sort of duality, I feel like we see time and time again, but maybe not in as extreme a case
Yeah.
as it's for him.
So I mean, we should talk about some of like these big moments.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many that stand out to me in the in the movie, and maybe this is jumping ahead. Maybe
It's okay.
I'll jump ahead a little bit, but
it doesn't matter.
Yeah. When I would think about this documentary, I would think about how crazy it is that he, because he sort of realized that his performances were better and more raw if he would go off of his meds. And so he would do that periodically, and we see that throughout the film, and you see video from these performances that is, it's about as raw as a performer can be. When I think, there's that performance of where he's in a record store in New York and he's hanging out with the Sonic Youth guys and screaming and to tears, and he's
right, religious ranting.
But the thing that really just sticks in my mind is how he in one of these scenarios where he went off his meds, he was playing at South by Southwest, I think, for a huge crowd of people. He left with his father in a plane since his dad was a pilot. And at some point in the flight, decided he wanted to parachute out, and his dad said they didn't have parachutes. So he just took the keys to the airplane out of the ignition and tossed them out the window, and took the controls. The plane, I guess, went straight up into the air and then straight down. And in the last minute, since the father had some training on how to sort of ditch the plane and trees, he was able to save their life. And that's just something, it's like, if I was being told this by like a friend and not in this sort of documentary, I might believe that was just part of the myth and not, that couldn't have happened.
Right. Yeah.
But there's photos.
10% of it is true. Right. Yeah.
There's photo. I mean, you see the plane wrecked. You see them going to the hospital. You see like Daniel. There's a picture they say is like right after that. I mean, like that day or that moment. Like he's got this big smile on his face, and his mom basically says, like in the interview, like, he thought he did something great. Like he thought this is what he was supposed to do.
Right.
This is a man who like really was at time possessed by demons as much as anybody could be, or obsessed with, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's just like a real, not connected to the same reality that most of us are enjoying or surviving.
I mean,
or whatever.
Yeah, and so first of all, hearing his dad recount that story, like from the first moment that he starts to talk about it, is like hard. That is hard to do. It is as emotionally affecting as something could be. Also, nice film, sort of craftsmanship. They sort of tease in a couple stills of the plane earlier in the movie. It's very like Chekhov's
I kept saying
stuff.
like, why are they showing him next to this private little Cessna or whatever? Like a little, like a.
They don't even
two-seater,
say
four-seater
he
plane.
was a pilot. They just show you the plane a couple times. It's pretty clever. But then so there's that, and then there's like, that's the second big event. The first one, he gets out of an institution at one point, I believe, or no, he gets out of jail, maybe. I can't remember which, but he's just going through this town in West Virginia screaming.
Right.
And he starts beating on this elderly woman's door because he believes there are demons in there. I believe is what he thinks. And he terrifies her so much that to out of fear of what is coming through that door, she jumps out of the window and
breaks both her ankles.
Breaks both of her ankles.
She's like an elderly woman.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, like it's like it's
and
really,
then in the
really extreme stuff.
In the instant when he's I don't know exactly what the interview's from, but somebody's asking him when he's been institutionalized after that, and he was like, "Oh, I was walking away when that happened." Like,
that was the demons. It wasn't
that
me.
was the
something like that.
The demons threw her out of the window or something. Yeah.
What I also love, filmmaking wise in the documentary is whenever, he did it's in this part of the film, and it's also earlier when he arrives in Austin, which he arrived in Austin because he started traveling with a carnival, essentially.
Yes, that part was crazy too. Yes,
which is also just like, if somebody told you that, you wouldn't believe. I mean, you just anyway. But I love it
about
the
Dust Bowl. What
right? But I love that. What I love about, they talk about a story there, and then the story you just told. The camera acts as like his perspective. Kind of walks to this woman's apartment, runs up the stairs. And there's no actors in it. We're not seeing like a reenactment of these situations, but in a way, it's almost more affecting because we're still using our imagination, but we're seeing what this would have been like through Daniel's eyes. And just watching it, before we recorded, I was thinking, man, that is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the stuff about him. I mean, primarily that one episode with the woman does kind of, bring into question the like naive, childlike harmlessness of his obsession with Laura, and with maybe with other people as well. Like, meaning, like, if he had the capacity, when based on his mental state, to snap and do that kind of thing and terrorize this woman to the point that she seriously injured herself, was it so innocent and childlike that he had this lifelong obsession / crush with this woman? I don't, it kind of, again, I mean, I think we just have a different perspective on that than we did when the movie came out 20 years ago. But,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess he was just in such a worse state at that time versus when he was in art school with that, he was in better shape, I guess.
And I also think that it's kind of unfortunate because it's difficult to kind of reckon with, but I feel like both of these things, the innocence and the violence, it actually can coexist. It's like it's like that complex.
Hey, this is Dave. At this point, Andy had to dip out to pick up his kid from school, so it's just me and Noah for the rest of the recording. Okay, no problem. We'll land the plane much like Dan's death. Yeah, okay. Exactly. No worries. Okay, so yeah. So okay, so well, I mean, we've kicked this around a lot, but I want to make sure we get get to anything you want to discuss. I mean, there's some other kind of recurring interesting characters in the film. I mean, we get a lot of his parents, obviously. I mean, the fact that they were willing to be so open.
Yeah.
They're not celebrities, they're just regular people. You know what I mean? And they really, both of them open up about their child and how emotionally it feels to see your child struggling, or not. Like, the one point that his mom is talking about how, like, when he was staying with one of his siblings and then he like disappeared, and ended up, they found out a month or two later that he had gone off with this traveling circus. And she just talks about how, like, much it hurt her every day to, like, know that her child could be like, in a shallow grave, she said.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that is like as real as it gets, and just the fact that they were, them and the siblings are willing to and able to speak so openly to a filmmaker and put themselves out there. Um, I mean, credit to Jeff, the director, and the filmmakers to coax that out of people, or to make that a comfortable environment where people felt comfortable doing that, because it doesn't just use. I don't think it just happens.
Right.
That's the kind of thing when I see a documentary, I'm thinking like, wow, what did these people have to do? What did this filmmaker have to do to get these people to be comfortable enough to do that? And it just makes for just such compelling film.
Yeah, and I
Amazing.
also wonder if at the stage when this movie was being made, if I would hope that I think his friends and people have a real reverence for his work and stuff like that. And in the movie, in the movie, it's clear his family really did not understand his 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 music or his art as he was growing up. But I would hope maybe at the time when this movie was being made that they would see, how much this guy's music has meant to people, and his relevance in maybe, I don't know, a certain sect of pop culture or something like that. I mean, I hope they would see that it is important. But I did think exactly the same thing that you thought. I thought to get people to open up like this, yeah, it was really remarkable, and is some of the most powerful stuff in the movie. I mean, when we're talking about that scene with the plane crash and his dad is literally crying, he doesn't look like a man that's an easy crier necessarily. So
Right.
it just sticks in your brain when you watch the movie. It's a really powerful scene.
Yeah. He yeah, you don't get the sense that his family are the type of people that would be seeking out the type of art that he was making. You know what I mean? Like the people that
No.
are into his art, especially before he really became well known, were like, I mean, indie hipster weirdos. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's who looks for that kind of stuff. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm just saying, like, you're specifically not listening to top 40 radio. If Daniel Johnston is what rings your bell.
Right.
It's just a different kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like it is a really interesting thing to think about, just in regard to, like, in quotation marks, outsider art in general. Just, it's like there's music that I listen to that I think that if it's like the parent test. It's like I
Yes.
love my parents, but if I showed them Daniel Johnston, would they be able to see value in it or not? And my guess is probably maybe they would humor me, and because they
Right.
love me, and say they
Sure.
liked an element of it. But I don't know if they would really get it. But for me, and it's just an interesting thing too about musicianship, because he was not a technically good musician. I mean, they talk about it. He played a pretty rudimentary piano, and then he started playing guitar when he moved to Austin, and he really couldn't play guitar. But for some reason, it's like he has a way of speaking. It feels even more genuine. I don't have a great way to articulate this. I mostly think about, when I was younger and I grew up playing music, I actually played with a bunch of virtuoso musicians who were
Mhm.
really, really good. Undeniably, like, one of them was essentially a child prodigy. And I was really attached to that kind of music for a while. And then at some point, probably in college, I kind of like completely turned my back on virtuosity and technical virtuosity in music. And I was much more concerned with genuine expression.
Right.
and and it just attracted me so much more. And there's something that Daniel Johnston does in his music that I don't know, it just hits you in a way that somebody who's a great musician might not. affect you in quite the same way.
Yeah, there's like a scene or two later towards the end of the movie when he's playing with a rock band
Right.
in his town, and
Of kids,
you know,
basically.
right, young, yeah, and they're not. I'm not saying they're technically, virtuosos. I mean, it's not like Steely Dan or something, but they're more accomplished instrumentalists even at a young age than he is. Just because
Right.
what he's doing is very simple, and they're backing him up, and it's like bass guitar and drums bashing away, and he's just kind of reciting his lyrics or singing, and it to me it doesn't work as well as the solo stuff.
I would
It just
agree.
doesn't land the same way. Maybe there's other stuff they recorded. I don't know. I only know what's in the film. But yeah, he, it's just like his drawing style, like you see his art, and it's not that it's crude, but it's he's not a photorealistic painter or something like that. It's not that kind of
Right.
thing, and it also doesn't seem, it seems like he would only get his art, music, etc., to a certain level, and then it was what he needed, and it didn't seem to like occur to him or it's not like his guitar playing gets better over the
Right.
like 30 years of him playing guitar. It's like he learns 3 chords, and then that's what he does, and he same thing with the drawing. It's not like it doesn't, maybe somebody who's really an expert in his work will see a stylistic evolution or something, but based on what's presented in the film, it's like the art that he was doing as a 20-year-old is not that different than what he was doing 20 years later. It basically is like, this is his thing, and it's what he's doing, and
Right.
and there is something appealing about that, because he doesn't, I mean, one thing that they keep stressing in the movie is that he seems to have seen himself as I don't know what to say, like a peer or something of like the Beatles. Like, he was obsessed with the Beatles, and he just didn't seem to feel like there was, he felt like what he was doing was something similar to that, um, and and so he at no point does he say like, well, obviously I can't play piano as well as Paul McCartney. You know what I mean? It's just like,
Right.
or sing. I mean, he's, again, his vocals are very affecting, and the lyrics are, sometimes very beautiful, like very interesting turns of phrase.
Mhm.
But it's not like he's a a a, a, a you know a trained, talented singer in the way you would think of an
Right.
American Idol type person or something. But yeah, I mean, he just got it across, and it's so, at some point, so like devastatingly beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that for some reason it can speak stronger because of it being the way that it is and its rawness than, like a perfectly produced, curated piece of music or whatever. But, it's it's interesting, like, there's a part of the documentary where, it's like somebody says something like, when he's playing his music, like he hears the Beatles in his mind. It's like,
Right, exactly.
it's like, so for him, he has this view of his work where he's hearing it in a different way probably than we're hearing it.
Right.
And him not being necessarily conscious of that disconnect between how we view his work and maybe how he hears his work, that just makes his delivery of it that much more kind of like I don't know, it's like awe-inspiring almost.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
it's like I don't know if naivety or is the right word, but it's like I was a musician when I was younger, where I was like, I wanted to absorb everything. Like I felt like it was my responsibility to listen to so much different music. And I got to say that it actually in some ways hindered me more than it helped me, because it created a situation where I would constantly recognize when I was ripping somebody off, or I would constantly recognize something as an unoriginal idea, or I would abandon a piece of work too early because I felt like it wasn't accomplishing this or wasn't accomplishing that. And that's just not something that an artist like Daniel has a hang up on. he may not even be aware of the musical world outside of what he does, aside from the Beatles and
Right.
these big acts. But it's that naivety that kind of gives him, that's part of his purity. It's part of what makes him such an effective artist, and it's like maybe runs countercurrent to what people would think.
Yeah, he doesn't have that like critical part of his brain, like being a, like listening to the music that he makes as a music critic, or
Right.
he doesn't have that thing. I mean, I always somehow find a way to shoehorn this into every episode because I'm obsessed with Guided by Voices. And it's not really a fair comparison, but there is a little bit of that there where you had this like guy, in the 80s who is just like recording endless numbers of songs on tapes. And, in the case of like Robert Pollard, he's like wondering why the world does not recognize that like this is the Who, or
Right,
as good
right.
as that, whatever. And to them, they got some of that recognition in a way, and maybe never got to the size that they wanted, but certainly, Robert's a much more stable and with it person. It doesn't have the same issues that Daniel does, and thank goodness still going and making great music. But there is a little bit of that kind of like drive to just create your own world, and that complete sense of like, no, what I'm doing is the thing, and
Right.
like there's no doubt or so I do find that appealing, even if it comes from people from totally different perspectives or different circumstances.
Right. Well, do you know that Kim Gordon quote? She said that I'm going to butcher it, but she said something to the effect of people go to see live music to see people believe in themselves.
Yeah, right.
And that's sort of all you can ask for, when you go to see a group or listen to a record or something like that. It's like that is kind of like a unspoken, maybe unconscious element of it, where you're kind of in awe of somebody putting themselves in such a vulnerable position, and either delivering it so confidently or delivering it so anxiously, yet they're still doing it. There's definitely an element to that in his music.
Yeah, no doubt. Speaking of which, one little piece of rock doc stuff that I noticed was like, I mean, one of the most common talking heads in rock docs is, of course, Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth appears, Sonic Youth are essentially characters in this movie for a time,
Right.
and yet he doesn't appear. Like, you don't get the talking head. I was like, here we go, Thurston Moore going to show up and tell us about Daniel Johnston, and they didn't. So I don't know if like they didn't try to get him or what, whatever. But it was an interesting thing. So I do want to kind of close the loop on something. So maybe this is something I just kind of discovered, although it was published a few years ago, was that when the film was being shown in whatever this was, 2005, the filmmakers had a screening and Daniel was there, and they, as a kind of surprise, they brought Laurie, that woman,
No.
to the screening. And there's film of it. I'll send you the link, and people will put it in the show notes and stuff. So yeah, it's really amazing. So like they bring her out, and she like and she has this like really kind of sweet reconnection with him after like 20 some years, and she seems like very like kind of pleased, bemused, or whatever that he had done this whole, created all these works about her. Like she doesn't seem to be creeped out about it at all, or anything. She's just like, oh,
Hmm.
he's such a sweet guy, and it's so cool that he did this, and he was always encouraging my art and that nice, like she doesn't. I mean, in this little piece, she doesn't have a bad thing to say about him. They have this beautiful reconnection. It seems like basically that they reconnected, and then like, I mean, that's basically it as far as we know. Like, it wasn't like they stayed in touch or something, but it is kind of a nice little bookend to the movie, and they do kind of answer a question in this piece or in this little video clip talking about why she's not in the movie.
Mm.
And it was a choice that they say they made, because it's like the character of her at that time as a young person, like in that moment, is the person that Daniel was writing about.
Right.
So her as an, middle-aged whatever person, 20 whatever years later, looking back on it or discussing it is not like she didn't have a relationship with Daniel beyond that. They didn't know each other. They weren't connected. And she's not really necessarily the same person that was this like icon in the, in his
Right.
work. Which makes sense as a choice. But when you watch the movie, because I watched the movie and then I was like, just Googling around and I found that clip that it does answer a question that you can't help but ask.
Right. Yeah, that is really interesting. And that is a really good, because it is in a way not relevant sort of it kind of brings you into his mind even more to not view her as I mean,
Yeah.
this is kind of messed up to say, but kind of as like a real person, she's
Right.
kind of like she's like an idea that he sort of feeds off of, whatever, creatively. And so
Right.
in that
And
sense,
that's
it makes a lot of sense. I wonder if it's just like the perspective of today and where we're at culturally, that you think like, cynically you'd be like, oh, this woman that he was being kind of creepy of isn't in this movie. I wonder why. But it's nice to hear that she, was at the screening, and that this was a choice not made because, wasn't like she refused to be in the movie because of some experience with him or something like that.
right. Or they made this movie and featured her without even discussing with her or having her,
Right.
be in,
Exactly. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what I was kind of wondering is like, is she going to like just randomly come across this movie and be like, wait, is this the Daniel Johnston I used to know? And then like be creeped out by her being a major character in the movie, but
Right.
it seems as
And
though they handled it all very well.
They say at the end of the movie that she's still alive and living in Ohio, and
Right.
divorced and living in
Right.
Ohio. So
Right.
when I was just watching, I was thinking like, that's kind of a weird thing to put up there for this person that, isn't interviewed in the movie. Like, are fans of Daniel Johnston going to seek her out? Is that going to be welcome for her? I don't know.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see what is put in and what's left out. We recently
Right.
did an episode about the new documentary about Wham on Netflix.
Oh yeah, I want to see that.
It's great. I mean, a blast. Couldn't be more different than Daniel Johnston, but also like this really sweet story about these two kids who just like took over the world and had this like beautiful relationship and friendship. But it's kind of there's some similar choices made in the movie where you hear from interviews after Wham from George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley. You never see any images the entire movie of either of them after like the last time Wham ever performed is the last thing you visually see. Meaning you don't see older George Michael, you don't see Andrew Ridgeley now, you don't see any of the other people involved later on, and so it's just like all captured in this time. And it's kind of even though like the two musical styles can be more different or whatever, like it does kind of it's a similar kind of thing where like, okay, you can see the filmmaker making these choices in order to situate you in this particular time and place, as opposed to a lot of rock docs where like you'll see the subject being interviewed, talking about when they were young and sexy and cool, and then it's like 40 years later and you're looking at him now and you're like, well, is that like scarves really working for you? You know what I mean?
Right,
it's
right.
Like, I mean, it's not necessarily right or wrong, but it is just kind of a different choice. But
did y'all have an episode about the Epic's Laurel Canyon series?
I know the Laurel Canyon documentary, the one with
Not
like Beck in it and stuff.
Yeah, not that one.
Yeah, not a big fan of that one.
Yeah, no. There's another one that was, I think it's only on like the channel Epics, but it's a great documentary. It's like a 2-part series about Laurel Canyon, 60s and 70s, but it's great. I love it because there's like kind of like you were saying, there's no talking heads of Graham Nash and Stephen Stills and these people in the scene at now talking back on it. The only people that are kind of talking heads in the documentary are the photographers that were taking pictures of the scene when it was happening. And we hear from, the classic Laurel Canyon people in audio interviews, but all we're seeing is pictures of them. There's not, it can really take you out of it to see where they're at now when you're trying to examine this one specific time in their life or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like, would Get Back have been better if you had like 80-year-old Paul McCartney being like, "This is where I write Get Back."
Right,
You don't need that.
Right.
Again, just different types of films, but yeah. Oh, I want to check that out. Okay, cool. All right, I think we kicked this one around. We tried to keep the episodes shorter than the films we're talking about. Sometimes we don't succeed, but we're kind of getting there. But anything else we missed about this film that we need to discuss, or do you think we kind of covered it?
I think we covered a lot. It's just so dense. I mean, you could keep talking about it for a long time, I think. And there's certainly, I'm sure, dozens of other opinions about it, but I just think people should see it. I think it's not a rock documentary really like any other one I've ever seen.
Right. It's not like sponsored content made for you to consume the, upcoming tour of whatever. It's a real film.
Right.
And it's done really sensitively. Yeah. I mean, it's visually really, we didn't even talk about that at all, just because of like all the film that he took and all the illustrations he's done. Like, it's so visually rich. They
have so animated sequences.
Yeah, it's tons of stuff, and that makes for a really beautiful, interesting watch. And yeah, I mean, it's great. His music's super cool. Check all that out, and yeah, man, highly recommended. So Noah Bond, thank you very much. Check out Cutworms, Bonnie Doon, coming to a town near you sometime soon. Who else are you touring with? All these other folks on your list here.
Cutworms, Bonnie Doon, John Andrews and the Yawns, occasionally this band Widow's Peak, occasionally this woman Anna St. Louis.
Yeah, she's good too.
There's probably more than I'm forgetting.
Kind of an abrupt ending, but that's the nature of podcast recording. Okay, thanks a lot to Noah Bond for coming on and for bringing such an interesting, super cool movie that we got to discuss. As we're recording this, which was a little bit after we recorded the interview, Andy and I had just a couple days ago, we went and saw Noah play with two bands at the Casbah here in San Diego, Cutworms and Sylvie. They were both incredible. So check out Cutworms, check out Sylvie, check out Bonnie Doon, Anna St. Louis, all of his many various projects. And yeah, go support independent music, people. It's good. Thanks for listening to Rock Docs. If you liked what you heard, give us a review, all that good stuff. Rock Docs is a Treble media podcast. Treble is a fully independent media outlet devoted to music. You can find out more at treblezine.com. If you'd like to support the community of writers and creators behind Treble, please head to patreon.com/treblezine. And yeah, thanks again for listening to Rock Docs.
You start off hearing this noise, then eventually you hear the Beatles. You hear the whole symphony.
But it was undeniable that something was dreadfully wrong with him.
He was thin as a rail and losing weight.
Was completely delusional. He was hospitalized almost immediately. He was obsessed with the devil and Satan. He became so obsessed that it was all he could talk about.
This is Daniel Johnston speaking from a mental hospital. They tell me I'm crazy here. Out come the demons. And I'll tell a story about an artist growing old. Some would try for fame and glory, others aren't so bold.